So, political entrepreneurship. That's what I'm talking about today. Is Uffe here, by the way? He's not. I found his keynote. Who saw his keynote in the morning? About half of the people, three-quarters. I found it quite fascinating. And actually, many of the challenges he talked about in terms of, thinking about the start of a party, what should it be, then the challenges after actually entering parliament, trying to find a new role and so on, are challenges that are faced by many, as I would call, political startups. I will talk about that more detail later, but let me start with something. Steinringen ended with a quote from Robert Dahl, and we haven't talked beforehand, but it fits nicely that I actually start with a quote from Robert Dahl, whom I also admire greatly, and it's a positive a quote in these quite dark times in many places for democracy. The democracy of our successors will and cannot be the democracy of our predecessors, nor, and that's the important second sentence, nor should it be. So democratic transformation is nothing new. We've made progress in the past. Why shouldn't we be making progress in the future? We can all help and be part of it. And I think, just to start with this, I don't think that political startups are the only way to help with this transformation, but they're certainly an important way of how we can actually transform 21st century democracies. And now the entrepreneurship part. I understand that in center-left circles, entrepreneurship is often associated with profiteering, with maximizing benefit, with extracting and egotism, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about entrepreneurship in terms of a much broader sense. I'm talking about this, about a pursuit of opportunity beyond resources currently controlled. Political entrepreneurship, to me, is about continuing the work of social entrepreneurs. I think most of you know Ashoka, right? Or the Impact Hub, for example. So there was this first wave of entrepreneurship, the classic business entrepreneurship. 30 years ago, approximately, the second wave started. Basically, people with entrepreneurial mindsets, tools, backgrounds, going into the field of social justice and trying to address big social challenges with entrepreneurial methods and mindsets. And that's, at that moment, the social entrepreneur was born. Now, organizations like Ashoka are helping social entrepreneurs around the world to do exactly that, to address social challenges with entrepreneurial means. Now, to me, political entrepreneurship, the founding of new political parties by entrepreneurially minded citizens, is the third wave of entrepreneurship. The third wave where we now can see that more than 100 parties have been founded since the last European elections across Europe, and many of them actually really, really successful. So political entrepreneurship, just to summarize, to me is about citizens like Uffe, citizens like Matthias Stolz, who helped found NEOS, who are trying to get new political parties off the ground with the aim to get into parliaments in order to transform the system, the political system, the democracy from within, with all the challenges, as Uffe outlined, that then, once you're part of the system, how do you stay true to yourself and so on. We can talk about that later. So I've written a book about that, and it's a great book, of course. It's titled How to Build Successful Centrist Political Startups, which is why I passionately disagree with what Hanno said this morning. And we already talked about that. I agree with a lot of things, but I disagree with that one. I don't think centrism is dead. I think we need centrism in times of Trump and Johnson. We need a re-innovated, rejuvenated center. But still, what I've focused on are centrist and liberal political startups. So I haven't so much looked at political startups on the left. So I haven't looked, for example, at Podemos, who are really doing interesting work in Spain. I also haven't looked to the right, because political science very much looks either to the left or to the right. Political science seldom looks actually into the center, because it's thought to be boring. It's it's not where interesting stuff happens. So political scientists are often more interested in extremes, but what I'm interested in is actually the radical center. How can we transform? How can we make this transformation happen? So, just a quick delineation. Again, what political entrepreneurs do is they try to transform the political system directly, as opposed, for example, to social entrepreneurs who don't necessarily want to run in an election, or policy entrepreneurs who want to have a particular policy actually put forward, or civic entrepreneurs, for example, like Fridays for Future, who build up a movement to change the political system, but from extra parliament, so not from inside the parliament. Now, a word of caution. Most political startups fail, like most business and social startups fail. And I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's an argument against a political startup in principle to say. But of those 100 that actually started, only 10 have made it into parliaments, or even less than that. That's absolutely normal. So those are the ones I've been looking at. And of those, actually only Nowoczesna in Poland, actually, due to huge mistakes they made. Uffe talked about some mistakes Alternative had made. But they made some huge mistakes, and now they're actually, unfortunately, because there's now the election in Poland, of course, coming up, polling in 1 or 2%. But the other ones have actually been quite successful. So Marta talked about Hungary. So Momentum in Hungary have actually succeeded now to get 2 persons into the European Parliament, and are now potentially part of a coalition that hopefully will be having the next, so to say, mayor of Budapest. We'll know on Sunday. Ciudadanos in Spain, En Marche in France. I don't think I have to talk about En Marche. Yesh Atid is the one from outside of Europe I've looked at. It's an Israeli startup, and Neos, which is my own party in Austria, which is now actually in its first government on regional level, and just made 8.1% in the election. So this is the now 2019 view of things. So most of the parties I've looked at progressed. So a quote from actually another famous person I really love is, if you want to change the system, you don't do it by fighting it, but basically by building a better model to make the old one obsolete. What do I mean by that? Political entrepreneurship is about building better parties. It's about building 21st century parties. Traditional parties often have a very hard time to reform themselves because there's so many vested interests, there's so strong structures. Think about the SPD, but think about many other parties that really have a hard time of disrupting themselves. Now, of course, if you start with a blank sheet of paper, it's much easier to actually do some things different, to build that better model that makes the existing model obsolete. Now, in terms of organization design, just to cite a few things, you can build a better party that is built differently, starting with the process. As Uffe said, you can start by co-designing a party. You can start by making a party much more transparent. For example, Neos in Austria is 100% transparent. All the party finances are online. No other party in Austria, for example, does that. That's an argument at the voting booth. You can have much more participation, bringing people and citizens in. You can have open primaries, term limits, all kinds of things that traditional parties often will find difficult implementing. But of course, one benefit of political startups is that they may then push other established parties to do the same thing because they see it can be done. So, with the remaining time, let me just quickly get you through the process, because I've developed, based on these interviews I've did with those 7 parties, a roadmap of how to actually establish a successful political startup. So, you have 18 months until the next national election. You want to succeed and get your party into parliament in 18 months. So where do you start? What's your first step? Any suggestions? Get together some money. So that's a very smart move, and actually a move that many political entrepreneurs tend to forget about. Fundraising is one of the first things you need to consider. Sorry? Media, yeah, that's another thing to consider. But just to stay with fundraising, for every country, there's a figure that gives you a chance of actually making it into parliament. For some countries, that may be 1 million euros. For other countries, it might be 500,000. For others, it might be 5 million. But if you don't know that figure, you won't have any chance. So that's one of the first things you need to know, even before you have the money. What is the number you need to fundraise against? Media is another thing. How do you actually gain access to the people, as we just heard, if you don't, if you're not in the polls, if you're, if you're nowhere? So you need to start about kind of how do you build your own channels potentially? How do you use Twitter? How do you use Instagram? How do you use those channels that don't cost you or not cost you a lot of money right from the beginning? There was a hand raise back there. So you won't do this on your own, right? I mean, politics is about collective action. You need to raise a force, right? You need to raise an army, basically. So you need to start with yourself, first of all. But you very quickly need to think about, sparring partners, first followers. You cannot have only chieftains. You also need people who help you with doing the legwork. You will do everything yourself in the beginning, but at some point you need to start to delegate. You need co-conspirators. You need people you trust. You need to get those people together. NEOS started as a group of first of 3 and then of 40 people who got together every 6 weeks and started to talk about, how would this party look like? How would the policy platform look like? How's the fundraising going, and so on and so on. So that's some of the things. So this is a kind of a very kind of 100 miles look down on what the steps are. So first, as I said, you need to understand what is the figure. How many euros do you need to be competitive? How many signatures do you need to be actually on the list? How many candidates do you need to run? All of that, there's kind of very nitty-gritty mathematical and research work. If you don't do that in the beginning, you will fail. So that's what you need to understand. This is why total outsiders of the political system won't be successful. You don't need all of those parties I've interviewed. They have had many outsiders. But you also need some people who are really passionate about politics and who really get what you actually require. Financially, in terms of people, in terms of technology, and so on and so on. So that's what you need to understand. But once you understand, you also need to develop a vision. Again, you can co-design a vision. You can co-develop a policy platform. You need a policy platform. You need some, as a political party, you need some content. You cannot just run. You cannot just run because you're so great, right? So you need to develop some core. You don't have an answer to everything in the beginning, right? You don't need to have a 180-page manifesto, but you need to have some core claims and a platform to run on. You also need to envision what the organization will look like. So you need the substance, the policy substance, and you need the organizational structure and process. And you can do that, with the group around you. And then you need to start to build. You need to build up competitive capacity. How have Momentum in Hungary raised their flag in the political arena? How have they done it? Anyone particularly interested in Hungary? Sorry? No Olympia, yes. So, No Olympia was a petition, right? Orban wanted to have the Olympic Games in Budapest, for basically celebrating himself and the party, right? How great everything is in Hungary. And then, but a lot of people didn't want that. It wasn't the majority, but it was quite a considerable number. So Momentum, who nobody knew at the time, started to do a petition against this project of bringing in the Olympic Games to Hungary. Now they've had 200,000 signatures within a few days of standing outside on the streets, and suddenly people said, "Who are those young people? How dare they stand against Orban?" And suddenly they were in the media. Suddenly they were taken seriously because Orban first started to fight them, and then finally withdrew the application to have the Olympics. So they not only were in the media, but they actually defeated the mighty party leader and Chancellor of Hungary. So basically, you need to be creative, of course. You need to be innovative by leveraging what you have in terms of people and raise your flag in the political arena and build competitive capacity. You need to build data. You need to build your database. How have En Marche done that? Anyone knows about France? How have En Marche very quickly built up their competitive capacity? They have done La Grande Marche. Anybody heard about that? Basically a big listening campaign, a big door knocking exercise across all over France, knocking doors with their smartphones, having a template of questions there, asking people things, basically doing a big survey across France, and very quickly generating lots of data about the French people and getting into conversation with French citizens. Then, of course, after perhaps 6 months in the case of Nowoczesna, very quick campaign, or 24 months, then you enter, ideally, right? You're in the parliament. And as Uffe said, entering for political startups is actually a traumatic experience, right? Everyone plans for the day you enter, nobody plans for the day after. Suddenly everything is different. Contracts run out, right? People knock on your door and say, do I still have a job? You need to, very quickly get yourself ready for the parliamentary machine. You need to get yourself acquainted with the processes and so on. So a lot of political startups have problems of adaptation there once they're in, how they actually then not focus everything in terms of resources and energy internally, but actually you still need to talk to people, right? You cannot just throw everything into the parliament. So that's a challenge. And then, of course, you need to scale. Like every startup, you need to finance that growth again. You need to grow your organization with that scaling. You need to run in all kinds of elections. For example, in Germany or in Austria, you have the federal level, so you need to run in communal elections, in regional elections, in national elections. Basically, there's elections all the time. You need to have the people for them. You need to have the money for them. So it's a frantic ride. It's hysterical. It can burn out a lot of people. And this is where many, like half of the startups who have made it into parliament actually fail in their first period because they don't manage to survive this stress. And then you also need to, talking of democratic transformation, they also need to start generating a political ecosystem where people, alumni, so to say, of the political party, go into other positions, for example, founding NGOs, founding social startups, bringing about the systemic change that it's about. And finally, I close with what's next. What's the next frontier for political startups? Two things that we're working on. One is because there's no infrastructure for political startups, right? Where do political startups go to develop themselves? So what we're building with the Innovation and Politics Institute are political startups incubators, like already existing for social startups and business startups. Incubators where we help new emerging political parties to develop themselves, to get themselves ready for campaigning. And we'll run two prototypes, one of them in Europe and one of them in Africa next year. And the other thing that we're working on, and the next book that I am preparing right now, is how can we apply some of those lessons, of those tools, of those methods from political startups to established political parties. So how can established political parties reform themselves, disrupt themselves? There's not much literature on that either. Because there are not that many success stories. And so that might be something that might also be of interest to help with democratic transformation. That's it from me. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Josef, for your inspiring talk. And I think we can say we now know everything what to do to be successful. So now it's up to you. Has anyone question? Yeah, over there.
Hi, Alistair from Berlin. My question goes in the, how would you define centrist? And I come from the understanding that I think it's very vital for I think, the next decades to come to not get up in the trenches of like left and very right, but rather understand the needs of citizens from rather left-wing to liberal to rather right-wing positions. And I was just in a discussion a couple of weeks ago with Volt, and I found that quite interesting, like this transnational party movement and how they're really trying to get quite a broad scope upon the different political opinions. And just your, like, because I have not heard your definition of centrist.
Yes.
What do you mean with that?
So I have a broad understanding or definition of centrist. So to me, in the classic framework, which of course we could discuss whether that still actually is applicable, but I would say everything from center left to center right. So that's broad. That includes Greens, that includes liberals, that includes social democrats, that includes conservatives. So I don't want to kind of. It's not about kind of. So is this party still in or out? It's not about that. I think I think we're pretty clear that if we want to win against, for example, Tories who have turned nationalist, Republicans who also have become populists. So I think that's where this polarization and that's where the problem is. It's a hollowing out of the center, of a broad center. We need a broad tent, and we need to bring people together. And regarding Volt and those movements, I think it's very interesting. I think unfortunately they were kind of too late for the book. Politics is moving so fast, I could already update the book in a lot of ways. I think they're a great kind of avant-garde of political movement. Of course, they consciously decided to run a transnational list where actually no such thing exists today. And it's amazing that they actually got 2 seats. But I think they will need to establish also operations on the national level if they want to be successful in the longer term. It's still the way it is.
Could you just wait for the micro?
I know that they have. I know that they have operations on the ground, but they also need to get into parliaments. That's what I mean. It's not just enough to have a representation. You need to be politically represented.
Okay, another question.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. My name is Boris. I'm from Berlin as well. Could you elaborate a bit on what your substance is actually? Because I understand that you spoke a lot about strategy and how to win election or get into parliament, but what for? And just out of curiosity, and a second point on the political science, there is very well a definition of political entrepreneurship, and the main characteristic is, let's say, organizations having a solution, looking for problems. So that is the direction of a political entrepreneur as defined in political science. So regarding the first question, I mean, I'm a liberal. So NEOS is a liberal party. And so that's what is my what is my political purpose, but that's not what I'm here for today, and that's not what this is about. This is about helping movements in the center to be successful, because I believe, as I said before, we need all kinds of different movements to help push this democratic transformation. So I don't want to get kind of in an ideological debate right now, because that's not at the core of my argument and at the core of this process. And regarding political entrepreneurship, so I mean, I've looked, of course, at the political science literature. Yes, there are various definitions. My definition is that it's about, as I said, founding political parties by citizens to get into parliaments, to reform systems for them. There are other definitions as well, but that's mine.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. There's a question in the second row. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Wolfgang Wodak. I'm from Transparency International. Mm-hmm. Do you think or do you have the impression that there is a big competition consulting Democrats how to get the power? When I look at all those big companies, the big four, who are in the ministries, who you can be bought, and they tell you what to do as a politician who wants to win, I think you're not alone with advising Democrats. And there are others who are much more powerful. We experience that every day, and politicians get weaker and weaker, and those experts get stronger and stronger if you can afford them. And it's the same with going for interest, with lobbyism. Going for interest depends on the money you have. If you go to the politicians who make the rules and you influence them with lots of money, you are much stronger. So I think we have to be aware that what you tell us what to do, the others know already. And we are in a political competition in this field, and we should speak more often about it.
Yes, I think the way to go is for political parties to become more transparent as a whole. And many of the established parties are not at all transparent or just as transparent as they need to be. And I think, in the 21st century, it's really important to be very transparent about where money comes from, what's money used for, and that, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So that's something that hopefully also other parties adopt.
Mm-hmm. Next one.
And not about Walt this time. I have two questions. One very fast, very short about what do you think about the 5 stars movement in Italy? It's kind of centrist. I think I have never understood which side they are, but they are definitely nor left nor right. So, and then the other thing is what we are seeing in Italy is a lot of these small parties being created, really tiny small parties, which are attracting a lot of smart people. And I feel like a lot of really great brains are lost in these small parties, which never get anywhere because they are just people just don't want to fit into the established parties, and that's why. But then the result is that these people are nowhere. They just try to talk with who agrees with them, and I think one of the reasons is that. Like the established parties have an identity, established identity, which we often don't fully agree with, but they still have something that brings them together, while these movements are all like try to respond to something which people feel against established parties, but they don't really have an identity. And this, I think, is a problem. And the intrapreneurship part is something which I think today we should focus more on.
So regarding your first question, there's a great article in The Atlantic, I think it's called If Techno-Utopians Run the World or Run the State, something like that. I think Cinque Stelle is certainly in some ways a populist party, in some ways unideological or apolitical almost. Strong elements of a kind of a direct democracy, which is very problematic. At the same time, of course, this kind of Rousseau platform in principle is very interesting. So I think there are some things to be learned from them, but I regard them with caution. Regarding the second thing, so of course I'm advocating here political startups, right? But I'm not saying they're the only route. So I'm very sympathetic to political entrepreneurship. That said, I'm very cautious with people telling me that, when I presented the book in Stockholm, a social democrat came to me and said, we don't need more parties. We have enough parties. And I said, I totally understand from your point of view that you don't have an interest, in conceding more ground to whoever else, right? But perhaps it's not in the best interest of democracy. So I'm not sure that this kind of whole, it's called either Dutchification or fragmentation of the party system, kind of that there are more and more parties. It's not necessarily a problem. You could also call it pluralization or diversification. That there are 3- or 4-way coalitions. The Netherlands have experience with that for 10, 20 years. They're still a well-run country, right? So in principle, it's not a problem in itself. Parties need to learn to be more creative about coalescing, about more issue-based coalitions. So the classic, two-way government or two-party government, perhaps it's a thing of the past, perhaps not. But I'm very cautious with, don't let people engage themselves with smaller parties because it doesn't have democracy. I don't buy that.
Mm-hmm. And our last question.
Hi, no, was kind of similar to yours, sorry, but there's you said there was not much. Sorry, Gabriel.
Who are you?
I'm Gabriel Schwartzman. I work in PR in Peru. Yeah, but I'm not from here. So
that's okay.
My question was like, there's not a lot of literature on political entrepreneurship, but there's a lot of in like startups or like business startups, So startup entrepreneurship, like the startup way for Eric Ries, for example.
Yes, I cited it in the book, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, my question was going to be a little bit like simple. Like, should big parties buy, like the big consulting firms that are buying new, more innovative, young firms, like should political parties like make this like buy or like alliance
Politics
with
by acquisition. So
no, something like that. Like could that start to happen anytime soon?
it might. It might. I wouldn't say that it's not possible. I think we're going to see many more new parties in the future. I think that's pretty clear. I think we're also going to see some established parties crash. It's very hard to, in Italy, for example, Democrazia Cristiana, right? I mean, it was there for 40 years, 50 years, and suddenly was gone. Parties cannot see themselves fail, but they do. And some of them will. And then some of the new parties also will fail and others will come in. So we'll see a lot of dynamism in the next years. And what I can say is that, I've been invited to universities to talk about this, and I've been invited to talk at, NGOs about this topic. I'm pretty sure a few years ago, I wouldn't have been invited because people would have been saying, entrepreneurship in politics, that's sudden, we don't want to have to do with that. So something is changing. I think that's great. People get more open, more people see themselves in politics, more people engage with politics, and I think this is what we need for the democratic transformation from center left to center right.